All right, the culture question. This is your question. This is a great question. This ties into the enterprise question, sort of, but it ties into a bigger problem, which is the culture of many companies is not conducive to a spirit of open cooperation. I was at a company that I won't name. Bob works there. And early on, and a question came up because I wanted to open source something. And of course, I'm a big, permissive license as far as I can go. And I wanted to do this permissive license, and the lawyers got involved, and they said, but you don't understand. Our competitor, which my new friend from last night works at, they could take that software, and they could do whatever they wanted with it. And my initial argument was, well, no, they'd leave the copyrights in there. And they were like, no, you don't understand. They could just take it, they could wrap it up, they could charge for it. And they have a massive distribution channel. They could just take us right out of the market, okay? And I thought about it. I said, wait a second. What kind of sales tool would it be if you went into a client and they said, oh, company X, we're using that open source project, or we're using their software, and you go, oh yeah, that's based on the stuff we give away, right? And so what the lawyer said was, try it. And so we did. And so we got it out there, we put it out around, and we got into a situation where we met with a customer, and we said, oh yeah, that's based on the stuff we give away for free. So our paid stuff is really good. And it was literally about 2.8 million, if I remember correctly, in a sales deal. And all of a sudden, the culture, starting in the sales organization, went from, we can't have that, we can't give it away, we can't make money with it, to like, we're going to print up some cards that just have this stuff on it. We're going to take CDs. Like they could not do enough. So how, the culture question is, it always comes down to one thing. How do I get my company who won't accept it, or my organization who won't accept it, or they're afraid of it, to use it? There's always 3 risks that all companies see, whether they articulate them to you or not. Number 1 is, it's different. That's not actually a risk. So just tell them, get over that. Number 2 is support and maintenance. IT departments religiously try to normalize things in an effort to make support better and to streamline it, okay? This has been my problem with IT departments for forever, and forgive me, anyone who works in an IT department. But I don't want to use the computer the way you want me to use it, and I don't want to use the software the way you want me to use it. That's how I ended up being in open source in the first place. So that risk, how do you mitigate it? You have to show them that it's not going to cause a disruption. It's not going to cause more work. It's not going to end up costing more money. Because there are companies out there who will pitch against open source by saying, you can't use that, because when you do, there's all of these ways that the costs creep back in, because it costs you in more manpower and more support calls and more this and more that. So you have to provide data. All right, so to get past number 2 with an IT department and organization, provide them data. Show them actual relevant data that is, this is how it could affect the organization. Ask them not to change everything at once. Everybody that asks the culture question wants to change their company overnight in an open source company. You're not going to do that, ever, okay? Those things, you couldn't turn that ship on a dime if you tried. So try something smaller. Try a pilot. Take a pilot, go out and say, we want to try this. Totally agree, I don't know if it'll work. I could be talking out of my rear, but let's try it with a small group or this small set of people and try it, because those people will become fans, and they'll start drinking that Kool-Aid, and they'll start helping propagate that internally more and more and more. And I've done it at 1 million organizations, right? So, I know for sure that'll work. And the third thing is, at some point, the lawyers get involved. It's usually if you're making product. And what are they afraid of? They're afraid of someone's going to sue us over that damn software. Somebody is going to say that we put some of their code in something, Larry Ellison, and they're going to say, hey, whoa, rights? Stole my stuff right here. And Bob also pointed out there's a lot of companies that will go through and check for that, so you can help mitigate risk by getting some of those tools and try to go through and make sure that stuff is clean. You can also mitigate that risk, though, by doing something really, really kind of counterintuitive to a lot of companies, which is just go and involve those people in that project. If you're going to take code from somewhere else, I'm all about stealing code from somewhere else. I just go ask the people, and I ask them what they want. And sometimes if the company I'm working with is going to charge money for that, they want to know what they're going to get out of that. And there's absolutely no reason they should do that. Why not, right? Open source developers aren't getting paid anyway and not making money most of the time, so they got to eat too. So why not cut them in and involve them in that project? So there's a bunch of different ways you can handle that. But again, those are kind of technical, logical reasons And it comes down to that culture, that whole free versus proprietary, that we've been in business forever and done it this way versus this new way where there's people we don't know that touch the software. Again, a healthy dose of reality will help with that. At the end of the day, none of you are going to go start an open source project on Saturday, except for me and that guy, and have 100,000 people contribute. And if you have 100,000 people that say they're contributing, they're just on your mailing list. And you go down to about 10,000 that might actually give you feedback, and you go down to about 1,000 that might actually do something. At the end of the day, there's always 3 guys busting their ass, right? 2 girls overseas that I work with in Europe working on a project who do 90% of the work. That's just the reality. So one of their big fears about the culture is going to be, oh, everybody's going to see the code. Everybody's going to do this. Never going to happen. I mean, very few projects. If you look at those hundreds of thousands of projects on SourceForge, a percent of a percent, right? Maybe. Okay, who asked this question? You're over here somewhere, weren't you? Who asked the documentation? That is an excellent question, ma'am. Where are those developers again? Would you raise your hand? Oh, you don't want to raise your hand now. None of you do documentation, do you? Interesting. So, yes, how can you RTM if there's not one? So, how do you get developers to do better documentation? You don't. This goes back to the other question, how do you get involved, and what Bob said about getting other people involved. There's a guy named Andy Oram who works for O'Reilly, who is part of a group of writers and editors who have started a movement, a couple of them, they're probably on the 3rd or 4th iteration, to try to say, hey, if you're a developer and you'll work with us, we'll help you document that software. Because documentation is incredibly important. But developers don't care, and hackers really don't care, right? Engineers care. And there's not a lot of those. There's not a lot of actual real engineers out there. So how do you get them to do it? Well, are you a developer or a writer, or what's your day job? Oh, is that Elizabeth? Hi, Elizabeth. SourceForge is not a lot. Well, you know, once Ross left, there was no one to defend you against me. No. So how do you get them to write more documentation? Well, you know, I would suggest that SourceForge actually open up, get writers involved, and start a separate section of the website and actually create something, you know, get Andy or somebody involved and get writers to do that and have open source that documentation. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it'll be good documentation, right? So you have to have some sort of governance over that. But documentation is incredibly important. And what? Well, I'm not endorsing Andy, so anybody you're talking to is awesome. I mean, he's great. I love him. I personally endorse him, but it's like anybody that will write documentation for open source right now, it should be heralded as a hero, because one of the biggest problems I find when I talk to companies who don't want to use open source is they can't get started, and always it has to do with the documentation or understand the process around it. Almost always. Okay, open source and HR. Where'd this question come from? Right there. Are you in HR? Are you a developer? Trick question. I saw you raise your hand. Headhunters, they understand open source because hey, it's true, and you know why it's funny. It's funny because they have like bullet list of stuff, and then they have like amounts they get paid for that stuff, and they see open source, and they're like, I understand it. And what they understand is the words open and source. If they're together in a sentence on your resume, it's a good thing. You know, having HR understand the value of open source, the value of what you do, look, it's no different than selling yourself in any other area, right? You have to explain to the HR department, if you're inside looking for somebody or if you're outside trying to get a job, why that makes you a more valuable candidate. Easy things I would suggest. I had a guy that came to work for me once when I was at IBM back in the day, and he totally sold himself on it. It was early days open source. He was like, yeah, but you don't understand. Number one, I work well in a team. You can tell, I'm like helping 200 people. Number two, I get leadership skills. So I'm kind of one of the 4 guys that's kind of risen to the top leading that thing. He said, you know what else? He goes, I know where there's 200 developers you could hire. No, that's huge value. It's huge value, right? And that's kind of how he kind of sold himself. And it was a great pitch. It was I do open source, which makes me more valuable as a software developer because I'm listening to trends, I'm out on the edge, I'm meeting a bunch of other developers you could hire, I'm demonstrating leadership skills in a way that you can judge from the outside. You don't have to look at my resume or call my old boss. You can go see what I said. You can go see how I handled problems, right? You can go see. And he went further. He gave a situation where they were having problems managing a person in the community. And he basically had printed with his resume the whole mail thread of how he like kind of got all these people that were fighting to get along. And it was impressive, and I like that because good teams fight. My team fought a lot. So that worked out well. I've got one, because I'm going to answer the noobs question for you, sir. And there's also this fancy timer iPad app or something, which I'm sure is not open source. But it says 2 minutes. Oh, it's 2 minutes overtime. My apologies. We'll make the noobs question quick. So Bob threw me off. The noobs question. So give me a specific. Are you trying to? You know, we talked about getting involved. They can get involved in the same way. There are so many opportunities. Everybody talks about open source. They focus on development. At the end of the day, there's need for documentation. There's need for people to give features. You know, the biggest thing I like to see in all my open source communities, I like to see people who are users. I don't even care if they're developers, they can contribute. I just want them to say, I tried to do this and it didn't work, or here are the things I want to do. So I would suggest all of those people can go on the forums, on the main list, go on SourceForge, other places, and get involved by saying, this is what I need. Because often, open source comes out of one place. We'll end on this. Open source isn't some crazy anti-proprietary software movement, even though it often looks like it and can be played out to be. Open source comes when a company or a developer fails to do the job the customer needed them to do. And customers are smarter these days. Your customers are developers. And when you don't deliver on what they need, they can go build it themselves. And they can band together in little groups, and those groups can build them themselves. All right? So the biggest thing is, even in those groups, those people had a specific problem. Brian Behlendorf and Apache, right? Good friend of mine, great guy. What was their problem? NCSA was going to charge a lot of money for all of the patches they'd done, right? So they said, well, it's a Apache server, right? And they put it all together, and they started that and devastated a market, right? If the price would have been right, or the features right, or all those dials would have been set to something different, they may have never done that. Their boss may have said, no, it's much easier. We'll just buy that from them. It's great. Okay? When you fail as a software developer, as a software company, to deliver the value your customer needs in the way they need it, they will create their own alternative. That's just the new way of the world. It's been for years, but it's getting more and more and more so. So if you're not a developer, it doesn't matter. You can still participate, give feedback, give user request, feature requests, things of that nature. So, FUD in education, look, it's hard. This gentleman right here, anybody who wants to talk about education, you should come up and talk to him. We had a talk about this last night about him traveling around to school districts, trying to get them to understand open source and software and technology in general. We are going to start a project out of this conference, right? And that's what's great about what Todd's put together. We're going to start a project right now. We kind of plotted it out last night, work on it a little bit more today, come up at the end, introduce yourself. We'll figure out a meeting time maybe later tonight or something. We'll all get together and we'll discuss that education question in great, great detail. But we'll do something better, right, which is we'll try to do something about it. It's easy, permissive versus reciprocal. Permissive will eventually take over. I have an argument that I won't get into now because it's too long, but I argue that the GPL is used. There's a difference between being the most popular license and being the most licensed. If you ask Ethan Gallstad at Nagios, and I've asked a lot of people, how did you pick the GPL? So, oh, well, I went on SourceForge, and it was one, I looked at projects, there were a ton of them that were GPL, and I picked it. I've talked to hundreds of developers who just picked it as a checkbox or a radio button, who never thought about it, who now have problems with some of the things that they are bound to, that they've committed their project to. If you talk to Greg Stein, right, he has a whole spill on this, on permissive versus reciprocal licenses. Permissive licenses will eventually win out. I mean, eventually. I would say that, do all of your software, if you want to be open, be open. And to me, I'm not a big fan of the GPL because it's not truly open. Because if you want to build it and really give it away, build it and give it away. Don't put your name on it. I've done that with 20 or 30 projects in my career where nobody even knows we're involved. We just like, here's some code, and we just threw it up somewhere. All right? That's being open, right? Don't be afraid for other people to take it, modify it, take credit for it, be better than you. Use that as a way to drive yourself to do bigger and better things. And with that, we're definitely out of time. Thank you very much.